Ariel Sharon, war in Lebanon. On the part of Ariel Sharon, in the design and management of the Lebanon war, the massacre in Sabra and Shatila, the Cohen Commission, and the resignation of Sharon following the activities of the terrorist organizations operating in Lebanon against northern Israel. Decides his new coalition. After the elections, Likud ordered the Air Force to attack terrorist targets in the heart of Beirut. Dozens of civilians injured in the attack. In July 1981, comes to the Middle East U.S. mediator Philip Habib, and after successful negotiations to bring Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization Palestinian, the signing of a ceasefire, respected ceasefire by Israel and the PLO. Meanwhile, Ariel Sharon instructs the IDF General Staff to prepare Operation Prevent Shelling of towns north by destroying the terrorist infrastructure in Beirut and forcing the retreat of Syrian forces in Lebanon, the Lebanese capital. Politically, aims Ariel Sharon to create the circumstances that will allow the choice of pro-Lebanese government, Israel. According to the plan, the operation, the IDF should take over Beirut within 96 hours. General Staff completes the preparation of the program in January 1982. IDF forces begin training under the program. Program is known as Operation Pine. Ariel Sharon spends months planning and fighting moves, secretly met with Falangist commanders, the Lebanese Christian militia. Sharon seeks bringing the Falangists to power in Lebanon. After the PLO expelled from Beirut, he sees Falangist ally which would liberate Lebanon, the grip of Syria and the Palestinian organizations. In February 1982, the Chief of Staff Raphael Rafal seeks government approval for military action against terrorist organizations in Lebanon following the intrusion the number of terrorists from Jordan to Israel. Government confirms airstrike on Beirut. While making their way to the northern border of large ground forces to prepare for a ground operation in case the PLO to Lebanon decide to shell northern Israel in response to the planned air attack on Beirut. U.S., fearing the collapse of the ceasefire agreement reached in the mediation of Philip Habib, opposes large-scale ground operation. Because of this, canceled the planned airstrike. Ariel Sharon said, later the U.S.-Israel relations, that U.S. support of Israel is acquired at the price of voluntary servitude, a gradual loss of independence, tentatively expressed by the Israeli government, to make difficult decisions, without having to bring them first to the Americans. Sharon believes that relying going and increasing the U.S. may turn out to be a mistake existence. On April 21, 1982, killed an IDF officer, landmine explosion in southern Lebanon. Government of Israel instructs Air Force attack terrorist targets in Lebanon. PLO not comment on this airstrike. On June 3, 1982, the Israeli ambassador to Britain, Shlomo Argov, was shot in the head by the terrorist organization Palestinian assassin Abu Nidal. Argov was wounded difficult in the assassination attempt. Over the years, Argov's condition getting worse until he was paralyzed from the neck down. Shlomo Argov remains hospitalized in the rehabilitation department at Hadassah Mount Scopus in Jerusalem for 21 years until his death in 2003. On Friday, June 4, 1982, the Israeli government held an emergency meeting following the attempted assassination of Ambassador Shlomo Argov and make a decision to order Air Force attack terrorist targets in Beirut and southern Lebanon. Ministers understand that if the PLO would respond to Air Force bombing attack settlements north, will have to be an extensive ground operation in Lebanon. Edited IDF division commanders in the north are the order of the operation of Operation Pine. Elite unit of the IDF mobilized and preparing landing fighters 10 kilometers north of the city of Sidon. Air assault of the Israeli Air Force Beirut has many wounded. Terrorist organizations respond shelling northern Israel, and from this starting an exchange of fire between the two sides. The next day, informs Cabinet Secretary Dan Meridor, the Israeli government ordered the army to ensure settlements in the Galilee will be shelling outside organizations' terrorists. IDF operation referred to by the Israeli government Operation Peace for Galilee. IDF entered deep into Lebanon. Initially, the IDF crossed friendly Lebanese villages and tired of the terrorists themselves are having spent rice and coffee. Prime Minister Menachem Begin announced in a speech in the Knesset that the Operation Peace for Galilee limited target and fight off the terrorists 40 miles across the border. For the states that once the target is reached the 40-mile fighting stops. As the army advanced deep into Lebanon, beyond the 40-mile, Defense Minister Ariel Sharon updating the cabinet ministers details of actions taken by forces in the field, but some of the ministers concerned and feel that Sharon did not reveal to them the true purpose of the war. Yitzhak Berman, one cabinet minister demanded the Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Defense Minister Ariel Sharon to report to ministers our war objectives to government, to make a decision about these destinations orderly. Berman emphasized that the government should not make decisions on operational military or other such moves should the IDF to the ground, as members of the government are not familiar with it. Berman insists that however government will decide on the objectives of the war, such a meeting is not held, and this is one reason why ultimately decides Minister Yitzhak Berman resign. Minister of Communications, Mordechai Tzipori, indicates that IDF operations beyond the 40 miles are the result of being dragged. Government have been avoided. Contrary to the government on a target 40 miles, the aspirations of the Chief of Staff, Raphael Eitan, they achieved the goals of Pine check the Beirut, Damascus, and control, and laying siege to Beirut, Lebanon. Early in the war, paratroopers and armored forces mounting Hevel River, north of the city of Sidon, far beyond the 40 miles. Soldiers operating beyond the 40 miles, it is clear that the government declaration of war target is not compatible with what is happening on the ground. The first night of the war, Israeli forces occupying Fort Beaufort. Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Defense Minister Ariel Sharon arrive at Beaufort next morning to meet the soldiers. Ariel Sharon praised the rapid achievement of the soldiers and said that was for Beaufort Castle for many years the threat and a nuisance. During the first days of the war, the IDF bombed the Lebanese coastal cities of Tyre and Sidon in preparation for the entry of infantry, whose task is capturing terrorists and the confiscation of weapons and ammunition. IDF's combat operations directed against civilian population centers because their fighters hiding PLO. Terrorists swallowed population, dressed in civilian clothes, armed with Kalashnikovs. Soldiers, in full military dress, with full military equipment and very large forces into the cities of Tyre and Sidon, and occupy them while dealing with stubborn resistance from the terrorists. IDF fighting in population centers causing civilian casualties. Example, in the ongoing refugee campaign Al-Hilway, shell hit stray military in a civilian hospital. Result of the injury: on fire 2 ambulances and motels near the population of a dozen dead hospital. IDF calls the inhabitants of the refugee camps to evacuate their homes before entering them. Thousands of refugees to abandon their homes and flee to neighboring fields and coastal cities. At this stage of the conduct of the war, the government of Menachem begins supported almost complete both the Knesset and the public. New Party is the only opposed the war in Lebanon. MK Mayor Vilner serves a no-confidence motion, and his Knesset speech argues that Begin and Sharon wage war unnecessary and dangerous for Israel, against the Palestinian people, and against the civilian population of Lebanon. A no-confidence is rejected by an overwhelming majority, and the Prime Minister Menachem Begin admitted the opposition parties for their support. In his speech he said, "National unity is one of the finest hours of Israel." Also media support without reservation Operation Peace for Galilee. On the fourth day Lebanon war consensus begins to crack. News broadcast images of the view from Dimur, located 10 kilometers south of Beirut, as seen after the IDF attack. Photos from Dimur clarify to the Israeli public, and the IDF is working far beyond the 40 miles where the government declared a port Operation Peace for Galilee. The rapid progress of IDF forces to beyond the 40 miles starts create doubts that the Israeli public regarding the objectives of the operation. IDF soldiers operating in Lebanon reported home their rapid movement deep into Lebanon, and Israel began to understand the government's stated goal of the operation is limited to so-called is not limited operation, turning out a full-scale war that is not limited in time or in the field. Prime Minister Menachem Begin put it all over again the target of the war, and said that in order to reach a point where a line 40 miles will be a line of peace, should enter Lebanon north of this line, to ensure that the terrorists do not return. The Israeli Air Force destroys the Syrian missile batteries stationed in Lebanon, and aerial combat Israeli warplanes dropping dozens of plain Syrian fighter. IDF forces continued to move northward deep into Lebanon, at the Beirut, Damascus, to sever the Beirut, and to impose a blockade, and manage to get to the outskirts of Beirut already. At this point begins to become clear of the target war siege, and joining the PLO in Beirut, the Phalange warring Christian Palestinians. Phalangist leader, Bashir Gemayel, who enjoyed the support of Israel. Over the years during the civil war, Lebanese blamed during the war the Palestinians, Syria, and Lebanon's ongoing destruction. On June 11, 1982, on the seventh-day war, a ceasefire is achieved through American mediation. Summary of IDF casualties so far: 214 dead soldiers, 23 missing, captive, and 1,114 wounded. Despite the ceasefire, the Defense Minister Ariel Sharon is not satisfied, because the PLO still entrenched positions in West Beirut. Ceasefire disturbed by the IDF, and Sharon announces that Israel agreed to a ceasefire with terrorists and talks with terrorists who want to destroy Israel. Beirut is divided into two parts: Western Muslim neighborhoods and East Christian neighborhoods. Border between the two parts of the city is marked in collapsed buildings, sandbagged, and fortified positions. IDF tightens the siege of Beirut, the south and east, and therefore the city is actually under siege. Within a week, IDF sent a large armored force of 400 tanks around Beirut. From that moment during IDF shelling consecutive months, and again the PLO in West Beirut stronghold. Shelling killed thousands of civilians. Chief of Staff, Raphael Eitan, said in a television interview that the army controls the supply of water, electricity, and fuel Beirut, and can tighten the blockade as needed. Rafale Pass IDF responds PLO threat imposing ton bomb in response to a sniper Palestinians. IDF soldiers gradually occupy Beirut street by street and tighten the ring around the PLO headquarters. Activity in urban places are soldiers and commanders in the dilemma of endangering the lives of men to risk the lives of civilians. Some IDF commanders believe that endanger soldiers cleansing buildings rabbi story, floor after floor, but to destroy the building with explosives. Following the IDF's long siege of Beirut being undermined Israeli consensus around the war in Lebanon, and Israel held demonstrations against war, against the continued presence in Lebanon, against Menachem Begin and Ariel Sharon, the siege of Beirut, and against killing innocent civilians. Participants' demonstrations against the war in Lebanon, soldiers returning from the battlefield. While demonstrations against the war in Lebanon are held demonstrations in favor. Israel rift is open and deep. Great animosity between the parties. Despite the disintegration of the government can win the support of the Knesset decision to sue PLO strongholds in Beirut, to evacuate and leave Lebanon. Siege Beirut continues. A few months after the start of the war in Lebanon is organizing the Peace Now mass demonstration. Participants are tens of thousands. Left-wing demonstrators calls are scathing, and hate-filled supporters Lebanon war. Prime Minister Menachem Begin reacted to demonstrations against the war, and it divides the people into good and loyal, supporters of the war, and bad and traitors, opponents of the war. Defense Minister Ariel Sharon imbued with a sense fabricated and opposition to the war led by the Labour Party. For political reasons, resistance resulting from the refusal of the left to recognize exchange regime. Shelling of the besieged Beirut and collect victims continue civilian population. Simultaneously conducted diplomatic efforts to bring port PLO from Lebanon. At one point in the siege of Beirut, Lebanon opposition comes from within the army itself. Colonel Eli Giva, commander of an armored division, seeks released from office. He did not find justification for the occupation taste and occupation of Beirut, and the price is high. Step protest of Colonel Eli Giva received criticism among soldiers who feel abandoned by their commander. Prime Minister Menachem Begin, where the Colonel Eli Giva ridicule that he took a drastic hurry, and without basis. Begin denies cancellation of the Eli Giva's claim that the IDF offensive civilian population. Another protest comes from soldiers Rose Menachem, a group of elite reconnaissance unit reservists sent to Prime Minister Menachem Begin a letter expressing a firm and unequivocal no confidence meet defense Ariel Sharon. Reservists argue in their letter that the war in Lebanon is not just war, and that the Israeli government had defrauded them by calling them to fight a war that is not defensive war, but a war designed to achieve political objectives, the lives of soldiers and innocent civilians. Prime Minister Menachem Begin writing Menachem response that Defense Minister Ariel Sharon does not need a trust, and that they as soldiers have a duty of obedience absolute. Begin seal his reply brief statement that Operation Peace for Galilee is the most legitimate operation ever performed. In addition to his protest of Colonel Eligivan Letterham, there are more protest action against the war in Lebanon. Soldiers returning from the battlefield Lebanon directly to the residence of the Prime Minister Menachem began and conducted demonstration. In mid-August 1982, some 2 months after the opening of the Lebanon War, Arafat succumbed to international pressure exerted on him and announces that directs the Beirut 15,000 PLO fighters left Lebanon and scattered among Arab countries. Defense Minister Ariel Sharon sees this historic victory. But the expulsion of the PLO from Lebanon implications. Lebanon itself, 2 months after expelled the PLO, Hezbollah established, whose goal is to act against Israel's existence. In 1984, Hamas established operating in Gaza and the West Bank. After the expulsion of the PLO, was elected Bashar Gemayel, the Christian leader, president of Lebanon. However, Syria will not accept Gemayel's election as president-elected Israel's military assistance. On September 14, 1982, 3 weeks after being elected president of Lebanon, Bashar Gemayel was killed in the explosion which destroyed the Christian Phalange headquarters. Christian phalangists seeking to avenge the murder of their leader. In this atmosphere, the IDF entered into Beirut to conquer the city. Prime Minister Menachem Begin ordered the IDF to protect the Muslims from revenge of the Christian phalangists. Nevertheless, the IDF imposes the task of eliminating terrorists hiding in Palestinian refugee camps on the Christian phalangists thirsty for revenge. IDF soldiers surrounded the outside refugee camps and helped Christian phalangist soldiers launching flares. On Thursday, September 16, 1982, the Christian Phalange fighters come to the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila and then begins to cook. Women separated the men from the refugee camps and run away crying for help. The slaughter lasted 3 days. Reports of atrocities taking place in the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila come from several sources in real-time Israeli television reporter Ron Ben Yishai. That night Ben Yishai contacts Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, reports on what is happening to him, and asks him to put an end to the slaughter. Ariel Sharon dismisses the report as Ben Yishai never witnessed the deeds. The next morning comes Ron Ben Yishai comes to the refugee camp and see with his own eyes how the Christian Phalange fighters collections of women and children and slaughtering them. Sabra and Shatila massacre, a turning point in the Israeli public's attitude toward the war in Lebanon and its goals. When news of the massacre reaches the public Israel, hundreds of protesters spontaneously flock to the residence of the Prime Minister Menachem Begin and shouting for the killer, and accuse the Respect and Defense Minister Ariel Sharon. After the massacre, illegal demonstration dispersed with tear gas. Speech carries Defense Minister Ariel Sharon in the Knesset. After the massacre, he declares that the soldiers and commanders were not involved in the massacre committed in Sabra and planting, and accuses the parties of the left's severity of the situation of Israel with respect to image the world. Tel Aviv is preparing a mass demonstration in which 400,000 people participating. The protesters are demanding an inquiry committee to investigate the events of the massacre Sabra and Shatila. The government, despite his initial refusal to investigate the massacre, yielding to public pressure, and establishing a commission of inquiry headed by President Supreme Court Justice Yitzhak Cohen. Prime Minister Menachem Begin, Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, and many IDF officers are among the witnesses testifying before committee. On February 7, 1983, Prime Minister Menachem Begin, receiving the report of the Commission of Inquiry on the events of the massacre in Sabra and Shatila late at night and ensures back Commission, Judge Cohen, did not disclose the report before the official release. Begin making the time at his Jerusalem residence. Defense Minister Ariel Sharon is staying in Tel Aviv office and waiting impatiently phone call from the Prime Minister. But this is not coming. The next morning, Secretary of Committee the investigation presents the report to the Minister of Defense Ariel Sharon. Cohen Commission determines that the danger in the Christian Phalange massacred Muslims will not taken into account, and not taken immediate steps to stop massacre. Therefore, the responsibility lies with Israel, and indirect slaughter. In relation to the Defense Minister Ariel Sharon Committee determines that it draw personal conclusions, namely resign. More state Cohen Committee in relation to the Defense Minister, that Sharon badly mistaken when he ignored the danger of the Christian Phalange commit acts of revenge residents of the refugee camps. In addition, the report states that the Minister Defense Ariel Sharon is responsible for not ordered to take actions to reduce the risk of a massacre by Phalange from those entered into refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila. After publication of the Cohen Commission report events Sabra and Shatila, the Israeli government convenes to discuss the committee's recommendations. Ariel Sharon refuses resign, but the government ultimately decides to transfer to the position of minister without portfolio. Around the government building, where the hearing is held, conducted demonstrations of left-wing and right-wing activists on the one on the other. These call for the dismissal of Sharon, and those shouting encouragement to Ariel Sharon. At the height of the confrontation between the rioters, left protester thrown a grenade at a group of protesters. Peace now. One of the protesters, Emil Grunzweig, injured and killed. A few days after the massacre in Sabra and Shatila, IDF forces hastily evacuate from Beirut. Following the evacuation of Beirut starts creeping withdrawal of the IDF southward to southern Lebanon. Withdrawal lasts 2 years. During this time, Shiite Muslims of southern Lebanon organize and declare jihad, holy war, the Israeli occupation forces. IDF faced with difficult guerrilla warfare. Car bombs, roadside bombs, ambushes, and suicide bombers. Demonstrations against the war in Lebanon continues. Reservists returning from Lebanon and go demonstrate in front of the residence of Prime Minister Menachem Begin in Jerusalem. As part of the protest marches against the residence of the post for the sign with the death toll in Lebanon, growing up. Anxiety and depression are taking over the spirit of Menachem Begin as the death toll, in late August 1983, announces respect, that cannot continue longer serve as Prime Minister and go home. 2 years later, in June 1985, completed the IDF's withdrawal to the security zone in southern Lebanon. Lost. The death toll among soldiers in Lebanon is 670. IDF will stay in South Lebanon security until 2000.